Hi everybody, welcome to this week's live stream lecture. We are talking about informal fallacies. Now, these are defective arguments that are frequently used or committed, and they've been used or committed so many times that scholars have created names for them and put them into book form so that students can learn about them, because we want to avoid these arguments. I've had a couple people ask me how to use them. You don't want to use them. You want to avoid using them, because even though these may seem like they are psychologically plausible, they're logically impotent. That means that they're not logical. They have poor logic. So if you're using these fallacies, usually it means you're a politician or you're trying to sell something, some kind of product. But that's not what we want to do. When we're constructing philosophical arguments, we want to construct good arguments. These fallacies are not just failed arguments, they're deceptive. So, what we want to do is we want to see what's wrong with these arguments and how we can avoid them. Also, how you can detect them when people are using them in everyday life. These are the mistakes in reasoning that are most frequently committed. And once you start listening to them and you start studying them, you'll notice them being used in everyday life. Sorry about the cat. She just won't stay out of the way today. Hi, Fritzl. Okay, so let's get started at the top with the straw person fallacy. Now, with the straw person fallacy, this is when someone's views is misrepresented so that that person can be more easily dismissed or attacked. So if you were arguing that the war in Afghanistan is too costly in lives and money, and your opponent replies this way: "My adversary argues that the war in Afghanistan is much too difficult for the United States and that we ought to, in effect, cut and run while we can. But why must we take the coward's way out?" So what happens with this is your point has been distorted to make it look like it's more extreme or more radical than it really is. Now that means your point has been made into an easy target. The idea that we ought to cut and run or take the coward's way out does not follow from the statement that the war in Iraq is too costly in lives and money. The straw person kind of distortion doesn't prove anything, but many people fall for it every day. This fallacy is probably the most common type of fallacious reasoning that's used in politics. It's also used in student philosophy papers. Excuse me, but I'm kind of having trouble with my throat, so sorry about the scratchy throat and having to clear my throat, y'all. Appeal to the person. This is also known as the ad hominem fallacy. With appeal to the person, this is rejecting a statement on the grounds that it comes from a particular person, not because the statement itself or the claim itself is false or dubious in some way. Examples: you can safely disregard anything Susan has to say about government. She's a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. Or, Johnson argues that our current welfare system is defective, but don't listen to him. He's a conservative. So if y'all listen, on both of those statements, those are defective because they're asking us to reject a claim because of a person's character, background, or circumstances. And those things are generally irrelevant to the truth of the claims. A statement must stand or fall on its own merits. The personal characteristics of the person espousing a view does not necessarily have a bearing on its truth. Only if you can show that someone's dubious traits somehow make the claim dubious are we justified in rejecting the claim because of a person's personal characteristics. And those cases are generally rare. Appeal to popularity. Appeal to popularity is also called appeal to the masses, and this is another extremely common fallacy. It's arguing that a claim must be true not because it's backed by good reasons, but just because a bunch of people believe it. So the idea is that somehow there's truth in numbers, and that's not the case, because a lot of people have believed a lot of things that are factually incorrect. So one example of that is a lot of people used to believe that the earth was flat. They used to believe that mermaids were real. They used to believe that human sacrifices helped to grow crops. And those things are all incorrect. So if people give you the argument that 70% of Americans believe the president's tax cuts are good for the economy, so don't try telling me the tax cuts aren't good for the economy, That's not a good argument. Just because 70% of Americans believe something doesn't mean it's factually correct. Another example is, most people believe that Jones is guilty, so he's guilty. So remember that just looking at the number of people who believe something, it's not necessarily going to be relevant to the truth. There are only certain instances when it will be. If the number of people who accept a claim as true are people who are experts in that particular field, that's a different thing. So if 20 professional astronomers predict an eclipse, then they're more likely to be reliable than 100 non-experts who swear that no eclipse is going to occur. So you have to look at expertise as well. Appeal to tradition. Appeal to tradition is another kind of appeal to popularity. With this, it's arguing that just because a claim is sanctioned by tradition, that it must be true. This kind of argument says, in effect, that a statement is true because it has been approved of for a long period of time. Appeal to tradition is fallacious because the longevity of a traditional claim is logically irrelevant to its truth. Claims backed by a long tradition can be wrong, and they often are. Some examples for that are: the death penalty is a just punishment for heinous crimes. This view has been the traditional standard that this community has always taken, so there can be no doubt about it. Another example is, ancient shaman medicine works. Native Americans have used it for hundreds of years. On the other hand, dismissing a claim just because it's traditional is also fallacious. The mere fact that a claim is the mere fact that a claim is traditional is also not a good reason for rejecting it. You have to reject or accept a claim on adequate grounds. The genetic fallacy is similar to appeal to the person. In the genetic fallacy, you're arguing that a statement can be judged true or false based on its source. In appeal to the person, someone's character or circumstances is thought to be the thing that gives you a basis to reject something, which it's not. In genetic fallacy, the truth of a statement is supposed to depend on origins other than the individual. So organizations, political platforms, groups, schools of thought, even exceptional states of mind, like dreams and things like that. So examples of this are: the new military reform idea has to be wrong. It comes from a liberal think tank. Another one is, at the city council meeting, John said that he had a plan to curb the number of car crashes on Highway 19, but you can bet whatever that is, it's half-baked. He said the plan came to him when he was smoking marijuana. The United States Senate is considering a proposal to reform affirmative action, but you know their ideas must be ridiculous. What do they know about the rights of the disadvantaged? They're a bunch of rich white guys. So in each of those examples, just because something comes from like a particular political perspective, or because somebody was in an altered state of consciousness, or because someone has a socioeconomic status, that's not a good reason to reject their claim. Equivocation. The fallacy of equivocation is when you assign two different meanings to the same word, the same significant word in an argument. The word is used in one sense in a premise and a different sense in another place in the argument. And that switch in meaning can deceive the reader and disrupt the argument, rendering it invalid or weaker than it would otherwise be. So one example is, only man is rational, no woman is a man, therefore no woman is rational. In that argument, you're equivocating on the word man. In the first premise, man means humankind. In the second, it means male, as in the male gender. Thus, the argument seems to prove that women are not rational. You can see the trick better if you assign the same meaning to both senses of the word man. So if you change the argument to this: only humans are rational, no woman is a human, therefore no woman is rational. Another example is, you're a bad writer. If you're a bad writer, then you're a bad person, therefore you're a bad person. In that second argument, the equivocal term is bad. In the first premise, bad means you're an incompetent writer. In the second premise, it means you're an immoral person. Appeal to ignorance. This is the one that annoys me the most. As its name implies, this fallacy tries to prove something by appealing to what we don't know. Appeal to ignorance is arguing either that a claim is true because it has not been proven false, or that a claim is false because it has not been proven true. So here are a couple of examples. Try as they may, scientists have never been able to disprove the existence of an afterlife. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that there is, in fact, an afterlife. Super green algae can cure cancer. No scientific study has ever shown that it does not work. So in those first two arguments, they're trying to prove a claim by pointing out that it has not yet been proven false. And here are a couple where they try to prove a claim is false because it has not been proven true. No one has ever shown that ESP, extrasensory perception, is real, therefore it does not exist. There is no evidence that people on welfare are hardworking and responsible, therefore they are not hardworking and responsible. So both kinds of arguments are bad arguments because they assume a lack of evidence proves something. A lack of evidence proves nothing. Nothing at all. Being ignorant of the facts does not enlighten us. Notice that if a lack of evidence could prove something, then you could prove just about anything you want to. You could prove that, since no one has proven that horses cannot fly, horses must be able to fly. Since no one can disprove that you possess supernatural powers, you must possess supernatural powers. Appeal to ignorance often takes the form of asking someone to prove a universal negative. A universal negative is a claim that nothing of a particular kind exists. Some examples of that was the flying horses. Can you prove that purple gremlins don't exist? Can you prove that leprechauns don't exist? Such requests for proof are utterly unreasonable because they ask the impossible. To prove that leprechauns or flying horses don't exist, you would have to do something no one can do, which means to search all of space and time. You can, of course, prove a more limited negative claim, such as there are no books in this house or there are no fish in this pond. But requests for proof of a universal negative are absurd and unfair. All right, moving on. False dilemma. In a dilemma, you're forced to choose between two unattractive possibilities. The fallacy... Hey, Fritzy, what are you doing? The fallacy of false dilemma is arguing erroneously that since there are only two alternatives to choose from and one of them is unacceptable, the other one must be true. Here's an example. You have to listen to reason. Either you must sell your car to pay your rent, or your landlord will throw you out on the street. You're obviously not going to sell your car, so you're going to be evicted. In that argument, it says the only two choices are sell your car or get evicted. And since you're not going to sell your car, you're going to get evicted. This argument is fallacious because the first premise is presumably false. There seem to be more than just two alternatives here. You could get a job, borrow money, take out a loan, or sell something else. If the argument seems convincing, it's because other possibilities are excluded. Here's another example. You have to face the facts about the war on drugs. Either we must spend billions of dollars to increase military and law enforcement operations against drug cartels, or we must legalize all drugs. We're obviously not going to legalize all drugs, so we have to spend billions on anti-cartel operations. That second argument asserts that there are only two ways to go. Either spend billions to attack drug cartels, or legalize all drugs. Since we're not going to legalize all drugs, we must spend billions to assault the cartels. The first either-or premise is false. There are at least three other options. The billions of dollars could be spent to reduce and prevent drug use. Drug producers could be given monetary incentives to switch to non-drug businesses, or only some drugs could be legalized. The next one is begging the question. The fallacy of begging the question is trying to prove a conclusion by using that same conclusion as support. It's also called arguing in a circle. This way of trying to prove something says, in effect, X is true because X is true. Few people would fall for this fallacy in a simple form, but more subtle kinds of it can be thought to be beguiling. So, an example is, thoughts are not part of the physical world since thoughts are in their nature non-physical. Another example is, happiness is the highest good for human beings since all other values are inferior to it. In both of those examples, the conclusions are supported by the premises that assume their conclusions. Another example that's a little trickier is this. All citizens have the right to a fair trial because those whom the state is obliged to protect and give consideration are automatically due judicial criminal proceedings that are equitable by any reasonable standard. Okay, so this may at first seem like a good argument, but it's not. It reduces this unimpressive assertion of all citizens have the right to a fair trial. It reduces it to this unimpressive assertion that all citizens have the right to a fair trial because all citizens have the right to a fair trial. So the conclusion of the argument is that all citizens have the right to a fair trial, but that's essentially what you're saying in the premise. The premise, those to whom the state is obliged to protect and give consideration are automatically due judicial criminal proceedings that are equitable by any reasonable standard, is a long-winded equivalent of all citizens have the right to a fair trial. So when circular reasoning is subtle, it can easily ensnare even its own creators. This fallacy can easily sneak into an argument if the premise and the conclusion say about the same thing, but say it in a different, more complicated way. All right, moving on down to hasty generalization. The fallacy of hasty generalization is drawing a conclusion about a whole group or class of things based on an inadequate sample size of the group. One example, all 3 of the college professors I've met in my lifetime were bald. Therefore, all college professors are bald. The sample can be inadequate because it's too small or not representative enough. In that argument, the sample is ridiculously inadequate. The most obvious problem, of course, is that the sample size is much too small, but it's also underrepresented. You can't draw a reliable conclusion about all college professors based on a sample of 3. Another example is, I interviewed over 100 students at UC Berkeley, and 80 of them were Democrats. Therefore, 80% of all college students are Democrats. So the sample size in that argument is also inadequate. No matter how large a sample you would get from UC Berkeley, it's not going to be representative of all college students. With their views ranging across the political spectrum, college students are a politically diverse group of people. The views of Berkeley students are likely to differ from those of students of many other colleges. Our last example for this is, for a whole week I stood outside the art museum and interviewed people entering or leaving the building. I asked them if they listened to National Public Radio, and 70% said that they did. Obviously, most of the people in the city listen to National Public Radio. So the sample in that argument suffers from the same problem. Since the survey was conducted in front of an art museum, the sample is likely to reflect the preferences of museum patrons, not the city as a whole. The sample, whether large or small, would not be representative enough. All right, moving on. Slippery slope. The metaphor behind this fallacy suggests the danger of stepping on a precarious incline, losing your footing, and sliding to disaster. The fallacy of slippery slope, then, is arguing erroneously that a particular action should not be taken because it will lead inevitably to other actions, resulting in some dire outcome. The key word here is erroneously. A slippery slope scenario becomes fallacious when there is no reason to believe that the chain of events as predicted will ever happen. So a familiar slippery slope pattern is that doing action A will lead to action B, which will lead to action C, which will result in calamitous action D. Therefore, you should not do action A. It's fallacious when there's no good reason to think that doing action A will result in undesirable action D. So take a look at this classic example. We absolutely must not lose the war in Vietnam. If South Vietnam falls to the communists, then Thailand will fall. If Thailand falls, then South Korea will fall. And before you know it, all of Southeast Asia will be under communist control. This argument was commonplace during the Cold War, and it's known as the domino theory because it asserted that if one country in Southeast Asia succumbed to communism, they would all succumb, just as a whole row of dominoes will fall if the first one is pushed over. This is fallacious because there's no good evidence that the dominoes would inevitably fall as predicted. In fact, after South Vietnam was defeated, they did not fall as predicted. Here's a common argument we hear in the gun control debate. If assault rifles are banned in this country, then handguns will be next. Then sporting rifles will be banned, and ultimately all guns will be banned, and our fundamental freedom to own guns will be canceled out altogether. So, if assault rifles are banned, we might as well strike the Second Amendment from the Constitution because it will be worthless. So, that above argument also fits the basic slippery slope pattern. The fallacy with these arguments is not because they assert that one event or state of events can inevitably lead to others, but because there's no good reason to believe those assertions. Things can be done incrementally. Now, keep in mind that some arguments may look like slippery slope fallacies, but they are not, because there is a good reason to think that the steps are actually causally connected. So here's an example of that. If you have Lyme disease, you definitely should get medical treatment. Without treatment, you could develop life-threatening complications. You could die. You should see your doctor now. This argument is not a slippery slope, and it's not fallacious, because those are facts when it comes to Lyme disease. Lyme disease can develop life-threatening complications. It can cause you to die, and if you get Lyme disease, you should definitely go to the doctor. So what you need to do when you're looking at slippery slope is you need to look at the causation elements there. Composition. So sometimes what is true about the parts of a thing is also true about the whole, but sometimes not. The fallacy of composition is arguing erroneously that what can be said of the parts of something can also be said of the whole. Here are some examples. Each piece of wood that makes up this house is lightweight. Therefore, the whole house is lightweight. Each soldier in the platoon is proficient. Therefore, the platoon as a whole is proficient. The monthly payments on this car are low. Hence, the cost of the car is low. So just remember, sometimes the whole does not have the same properties as the parts. But pay attention for when the whole does have the same properties as the parts. If each part of the rocket is made of steel, then the whole rocket is made of steel. And our last one is division. If you turn the fallacy of composition upside down, you'll get the fallacy of division. And this is arguing erroneously that what can be said of the whole can be said of the parts. Here are some examples. The house is heavy, therefore every part of the house is heavy. That's not true, because like one little tiny nail is not heavy. The platoon is very effective, therefore every member of the platoon is effective. You could have a platoon that's effective, but have one member who lags behind and doesn't pull their weight, but the others make up for them. That herd of elephants eats an enormous amount of food each day. Therefore, each elephant in the herd eats an enormous amount of food each day. Well, what about the little tiny baby elephants? What about those? By the way, baby elephants are adorable and I love them. Not that that's relevant. Okay, so this brings me to one other point here. My breakdown of types of informal fallacies, you don't have to remember all of these specific names of these fallacies, but you do need to realize that someone is trying to throw you off in some way with their argument. And one way that you can do that is by thinking about relevance, causation, and misdirection. And so with relevance, what's the relationship between the premises and the conclusions? How are those premises relevant to the conclusion? And since I have a background in law, I like to take a look at Black's Law Dictionary for this one. If something is relevant, it means it's logically connected and tending to prove or disprove the matter in issue. Next, with causation. Again, take a look at that relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Is there a causal connection between the premises and the conclusion? So does something produce an effect, or is it just the case that something came before something else in time? Just because something comes before something else in time doesn't mean it has a causal effect. And then with misdirection, what you want to do is you want to take a look at the premises and the conclusion and say, is there something that throws you off? Do the premises misdirect your attention from the conclusion? All right, y'all, the best way to learn these and to understand them and to really get good at identifying them is to practice, 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 practice. So, if y'all take a look at the philosophy department website, you'll see that there are many examples of each of these different fallacies. And again, the best way to learn them is just to practice. Okay, everybody, thanks for paying attention during this lecture. I'll see y'all next time.